Hello, students. Today we are going to know human rights in the British period. In today's session, I welcome you all to address the question of human rights in the British period. We know that human rights means the basic rights and freedoms that belong to every human being, such as right to life, right to speech and expression, right to be treated equally, and to have dignity. But under colonial rule, these rights were consistently denied to Indians. So today, our agenda is very clear. First, we will understand what human rights meant in the context of British India. Second, we will look at the nature of imperial rule itself and why it was incompatible with democracy and freedom. Then we will move on to economic exploitation, especially taxation policies, drain of wealth, forced labor, and the destruction of Indian industries. After that, we will focus on social and cultural oppression. For example, how education, gender equality, and community rights were undermined during British period. We'll also look at how the Britishers used religious divides to maintain their power, and finally, how all of this shaped India's struggle for freedom. In short, we will connect each abuse of human rights with the broader nationalist movement. By the end of this lecture, you will see that Indian freedom struggle was not only about political independence, but also a fight for the most basic human rights. In this lecture, we set the foundation for our discussion. When we say human rights in the British period, we are referring to the time between 1757, when the East India Company gained control after the Battle of Plassey, till 1947, when India became independent. During this long colonial period, the basic rights of Indians were systematically denied. The British claimed that they were bringing order, modernity, and progress, but behind these claims was a system of exploitation that worked against human dignity. Instead of democracy, there was monarchy, and that too a very unjust monarchy. Instead of equality, there was racial discrimination. Instead of economic security, there was poverty and famine. Every part of life in India, political, economic, social, and cultural, was deeply affected by the British policies. It is important to understand that while Western countries were developing strong ideas about democracy, liberty, and equality in the 18th and 19th centuries, the same values were not applied in colonies like India. Britain promoted human rights at home but denied them abroad. That is why uh, a book was written by Dadabhai Naoroji, Un-British Rule in India. That meant that Britain, that stood for the values of liberty, equality, were totally denied in British India. This double standard is central to our topic. So, in today's lecture, we will explore this contradiction. We'll see how British colonialism systematically violated human rights. We'll analyze different areas: political rights, economic justice, social equality, cultural identity, and show that the freedom struggle was deeply rooted in the demand for human rights. To understand why human rights were denied during the British period, we must first understand the nature of imperial rule. By definition, imperialism means ruling over another nation by force. The British in India did not rule with the consent of the people. They ruled through military power, administrative control, and laws that served their own interests. After the revolt of 1857, India came under direct rule of the British Crown. The Queen's Proclamation of 1858 promised fairness, but in reality, Indians were excluded from governance. The only change was that of the name. Instead of East India Company, now it was the British monarch who was ruling, but the practices were same. The nature of exploitation was same. The British monarchy, represented by the Viceroy, had the final word in all matters. Indians could not participate in decision making, and whenever they demanded more representation, their requests were ignored or suppressed. Imperial rule was therefore completely incompatible with democracy. There were no elections, no equal rights, no civil liberties. British officers considered themselves superior while Indians were treated as subjects. Not only subjects but slaves. The system of law and order was created not to protect the people but to protect the rulers. It is also important to note that this form of rule was designed to exploit Indian resources. Every law, every institution, and every text was aimed at benefiting Britain, not India. Thus, the very foundation of imperial rule was a violation of human rights. Indians were ruled without consent. And of course, they were denied political participation and reduced to second class citizens in their own land. When we speak about human rights, one of the most important aspects is political freedom, the right to speak, to write, freedom to write, to meet, and to criticize authority. Under British rule, all these rights were denied to Indians. The Britishers were extremely cautious about any expression of dissent. Newspapers and journals were closely monitored. If any Indian newspaper published material that criticized the government, it was censored or banned. Laws such as Vernacular Press Act of 1878 were specifically designed to suppress Indian voices. Writers, journals, and editors were frequently arrested for sedition, which simply meant criticizing colonial rule. Similarly, freedom of speech in public gathering was limited. Meetings could be broken up by police, and leaders could be arrested without trial. Peaceful protests were often treated as crime. The infamous sedition law under Section 124A of the Indian Penal Code was a powerful weapon used to silence nationalist leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak and later Mahatma Gandhi. Indians were also denied democratic representation. The legislative councils that were created under British rule were dominated by officials with only token Indian participation. Even the reforms introduced in 1892 and 1909 gave Indians very limited powers. So, the basic political rights that we take for granted today, freedom of speech, press, association, and participation in governance, were all systematically denied. This created a climate of fear, frustration, and resistance among the people. And it is one of the strongest examples of human rights violations in the British period. Another key dimension of human rights is economic security. We have discussed in detail in our previous lectures the importance of economic rights, economic freedom, and economic justice. The right to livelihood, the right to property, and the right to be free from exploitation. Under British rule, these rights were ruthlessly denied. The land revenue systems introduced by the British, zamindari, rayatwari, and mahalwari, were exploitative in nature. Peasants were forced to pay heavy land taxes, often in cash, regardless of whether crops succeeded or failed. This was a complete break from older systems, where taxes were collected in kind and were adjusted according to harvest. Now, even if crop failed due to drought or flood, peasants had to pay the same amount. Failure to pay meant loss of land and other inhuman punishments. This created widespread insecurity. Traditional rights of cultivators were destroyed. The new systems empowered landlords and colonial officials, while the actual tillers of the soil were left vulnerable. For the first time in Indian history, large number of landless peasants were created. Economic oppression was not only about taxation. The British also destroyed Indian industries, especially textiles, to create a market for British goods. India, once the world's leading producer of cotton textiles, was reduced to a supplier of raw cotton. The deliberate policy of deindustrialization threw millions of artisans and weavers into poverty. Thus, economic policies under colonial rule were not neutral. They were direct violations of the human rights to livelihood and dignity. The denial of economic insecurity led to hunger, unemployment, and immense suffering for ordinary Indians. The taxation system under the British was not only exploitative but also extremely cruel in its enforcement. The tax collectors were given authority to extract revenue at any cost, and peasants who defaulted faced terrible punishments. Historical accounts tell us that peasants unable to pay taxes were subjected to inhuman treatment. Some were locked up in cages and left exposed to the burning sun for hours. Others were physically beaten or tortured to extract payment. There are also stories of fathers being forced to sell their children in order to pay land revenue. Such brutal practices highlight the complete absence of compassion in colonial governance. The land tax burden was extremely heavy, often as much as half of the total produce. Even in years of famine or crop failure, the demand did not decrease. This led to widespread indebtedness as peasants borrowed money at high interest rates from local moneylenders just to survive. When they failed to repay, they lost their land. The permanent settlement of 1793, especially in Bengal, made things worse because the taxes were permanently fixed with no regard for changing circumstances. Instead of providing stability, it trapped peasants in endless poverty. Through such practices, the British destroyed the bond between people and their land. They created generations of landless laborers who had no security and no rights. Clearly, this was not just economic policy, it was a gross violation of human rights, stripping people of dignity, freedom, and hope. The denial of human rights in the British period extended beyond agriculture into industry and labor. India was historically famous for its handicrafts, especially textiles. Bengal's muslin, Gujarat's cotton, and the fine silks of Varanasi were in demand across the world. But the arrival of the British marked the destruction of this flourishing sector. The East India Company first imposed monopolies on trade. They stopped paying weavers in pounds and instead used revenues extracted from India. Later, they forced down prices and cut off India's access to foreign markets. By the late 18th century, Indian textiles could not compete because the British imposed heavy duties on Indian cloth while allowing British made textiles to enter India freely. This economic attack was often backed by direct violence. Accounts suggest that British soldiers destroyed looms in Bengal and even cut off the thumbs of skilled weavers so that they could not practice their craft. Whether literal or symbolic, this shows the extent of brutality used to crush Indian industries. As a result, millions of artisans and their families lost their livelihood. Women who traditionally worked in spinning and weaving were forced into agricultural labor or reduced to extreme poverty. A once thriving industry and creative industry was deliberately wiped out to serve the interests of the British factories. This destruction of India's artisan class was not simply an economic change, it was a violation of the right to work, the right to fair livelihood, and the right to dignity. Labor was exploited, creativity was suppressed, and entire communities were left destitute. One of the gravest human rights violations under British rule was the repeated occurrence of famines and the failure of the colonial governments to provide relief. Famines had occurred earlier in Indian history, but under the British rule, they became far more frequent and deadly. The reason was simple. Colonial policies prioritized revenue collection and export of crops over the survival of Indian peasants. For example, during famines, food continued to be exported from India to Britain. Grain was transported out of famine stricken regions while millions of Indians starved. British officials justified this by saying that interfering with the free market was not their responsibility. In reality, this policy of non intervention led to mass deaths. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 killed nearly 10 million people. Later, in the 19th century, famines in Madras, Bombay, and other regions killed millions more. During the late 19th century alone, over 20 million Indians perished in famine. Each time the colonial government was either indifferent or slow to act. Relief measures, when they existed, were minimal and designed more to protect revenues than to save lives. This was a violation of the most basic human rights, the right to food and survival. Instead of using India's vast resources to protect its people, the British drained wealth for their own benefits. The famine policy demonstrates how colonialism prioritized profit over human life, leaving deep scars on Indian society and contributing to poverty for generations. Human rights are not only about political or economic freedom, they also include cultural rights. The right of a people to preserve their traditions, education system, and way of life. Under British rule, India's rich cultural and educational traditions were systematically undermined. Before the British, India had a widespread network of village schools, madrasas, and pathshalas and gurukuls. Education was rooted in the Guru Shishya tradition, where knowledge was passed down in holistic way, including philosophy, language, mathematics, and spirituality. Therefore, Britishers decided that if they have to rule for a long time and keep a control on India, they need to destroy this very foundation of the Indian society, the Gurukuls. Britishers disrupted this system. Will Durant noted that when the British arrived, there were communal schools managed by village communities, but by 1930 only fraction of them remained. The introduction of English education through Macaulay's Minutes of 1835 replaced Indian systems of learning. The aim was not to empower Indians, but to create a small class of clerks and intermediaries who would serve the colonial administration. As Macaulay himself put it, the goal was to produce people, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellects. The traditional centers of learning, like madrasas, pathshalas, and gurukuls, and even great universities like Nalanda, were neglected while English schools received support. Indian languages and literature were devalued, and generations grew up with a colonial mindset. They were, in fact, given a temptation that all those who study in convent will be given government job. That was a temptation enough to leave the traditional systems of pathshalas and gurukuls and switch over to the convents, and this is how convents were created by the Britishers, destroying or at the cost of Indian indigenous system of education. This policy undermined cultural rights and identity. It disconnected Indians from their heritage, imposed a foreign worldview, and denationalized the Indian mind. While English later became a tool for empowerment, at the time it was a deliberate instrument of domination. Another neglected area of human rights in the British period was gender equality. Colonial policies did not improve the condition of women. In fact, in many cases, they worsened it. The destruction of Indian industries particularly affected women because spinning, weaving, and other artisanal activities had traditionally provided them with income and dignity. When policies destroyed the textile industry, women lost this traditional source of livelihood. Many were forced into agricultural labor under harsh conditions, while others faced unemployment and poverty. This was a direct violation of their economic rights. Education for girls was almost entirely neglected. Well, Durant pointed out that by 1930, only 1% of Indian girls received schooling. Traditional systems had offered at least some opportunities, but colonial neglect ensured that women were left behind in literacy and learning. If you go back to the Vedic period, one may find that women had full access to education. There are examples of Vedacharinis, those who were well versed in Vedas and Vedic literature, like Gargi, Maitri, um, Lopamudra, etc., etc. They were not only great scholars, but some of them had been the vice chancellors of the universities. And there are instances where women were referring the Dharma Shastra debates. Just imagine their expertise in the subject. More, besides education and industries, rural poverty caused by exploitative taxation also fell heavily on women. When families had to sell land or children to pay taxes, women bore the brunt of suffering. Malnutrition, illiteracy, and forced labor became part of their daily lives. It is true that social reformers like Rajaram Mohan Roy and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar worked for women upliftment during this period. He is often known as the father of Indian Renaissance. And certain colonial laws like the abolition of sati, widow remarriages, raising the marriageable age for girls, uh, did reflect some kind of progress. But overall, the colonial system did not prioritize gender justice. Women remained among the most vulnerable victims of human rights violations under British rule. Not only in terms of economic and educational, but if you go by the laws with regard to crimes and violence against women, one may find very, very biased laws drafted by the Britishers for women or in the context of women. For example, rape law was drafted by the Britishers that gave, if you make a critical evaluation of that, it gave a safe escape to the culprits. And who were the culprits? Usually the zamindars, big landlords, and the British officials. And the victim had little safeguards under the rape law that was drafted by the Britishers. This antique piece of law, rape law, was reformed for the first time in 1982 after Mathura tribal rape case or trial. Another dimension of human rights is equality before law and access to justice. Under British rule, the principle was entirely absent. The legal system was not designed to protect Indians, it was designed to protect British interests. Indians faced discrimination in courts and administration. British officers enjoyed privileges and immunity, while ordinary Indians could be punished harshly even for a small crime. In cases of conflict, the word of a British officer was always valued above that of an Indian. Laws were made to serve the rulers, not the ruled. For example, peasants who could not pay taxes were punished brutally, while moneylenders and zamindars who exploited them were protected. The sedition law under Section 124A criminalized free expression, making justice secondary to control. The police and judicial system were also instruments of repression. Peaceful protests were broken up violently, and participants were often jailed without a fair trial. The infamous Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919 symbolized how colonial law was enforced with bullets rather than fairness. In short, there was no concept of social justice. There was no equality before law, no protection of rights, and no fairness in administration. The British used law as a tool of control rather than a means of justice. This denial of social justice further highlighted the incompatibility of colonialism with the idea of human rights. Another form of human rights abuses under British rule was the forced militarization of Indians, of course. India was often referred to as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. But that also meant Indians were forced to serve as the backbone of Britain's military might. Not only the natural resources of India were exploited, but the human resource of India was also exploited brutally by the Britishers. Millions of Indian soldiers were recruited, often under pressure, into the colonial army. They were not fighting for India's interests, but for the expansion and protection of the British Empire across the globe. Indian troops were used in Afghanistan, Burma, China, and later in Europe during World War I and World War II. This militarization came at a huge cost. Indian taxes were used to fund military campaigns abroad. In fact, in 1922, 64% of total Indian revenue was spent on the army, most of which served British imperial purposes. This meant less money for food, education, healthcare, or famine relief in India. Moreover, Indian soldiers did not enjoy equal treatments. They were paid less than British soldiers and denied the same privilege. Their rights and dignity as human beings were ignored. The revolt of 1857 was partly a reaction to this exploitation. Indian sepoys realized that they were being used as tools of a foreign power. Thus, militarization was not only an economic burden but also a violation of human rights. Indians were forced to fight and die for a cause that was not of their own, while their families at home continued to suffer poverty and oppression. The denial of human rights under British rule did not go unnoticed. Many thinkers, both Indians and foreign, exposed the exploitation and criticized the colonial system. These intellectual critiques were important because they provided a moral and philosophical foundation for the freedom struggle. One powerful voice was Will Durant, an American historian who described British rule as the greatest crime in all history. He emphasized how a prosperous civilization had been systematically destroyed by a trading company motivated only by greed. J.T. Sutherland, an American Unitarian minister, praised India's past prosperity and condemned its destruction under colonialism. Dadabhai Naoroji, an Indian nationalist leader, developed the famous drain theory, which showed how wealth was being systematically transferred from India to Britain, leaving Indians impoverished. Bankim Chand Chatterjee, a nationalist writer, highlighted the greed of the British, while William Digby documented the extent of famine and poverty caused by colonial policies. These writings made it clear that British rule was not a civilizing mission, but a system of exploitation and oppression. Such critique not only informed Indians but also gained attention internationally, weakening Britain's moral justification for imperialism. They framed the independence struggle as not just a political movement but as a fight for justice and human rights. Intellectual voices gave legitimacy to the claim that colonial rule was incompatible with human dignity, democracy, and fairness. From the late 19th century onwards, organizations like the Indian National Congress began to demand greater representation, civil liberties, and economic justice. Leaders such as Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Annie Besant, Mahatma Gandhi, and Jawaharlal Nehru highlighted the denial of basic rights under colonial rule. The Indian press also played a major role, exposing abuses of power and highlighting issues like famine, poverty, and racial discrimination. Peaceful protests, strikes, and demonstrations became ways for Indians to demand their rights. Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha or truth force was essentially a moral appeal for human dignity and freedoms. There were movements like non-cooperation movement, civil disobedience, Quit India movement that challenged the British denial of human rights. They demanded freedom of speech, right to assemble, the right to self-governance, and economic justice for the poor. Not only these movements, but there were large number of revolutionary movements also by young Indians like Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, Chandrasekhar Azad, who happily accepted death sentence but did not bow before the British rule just to prove the high moral ground of their resistance to British rule and British practices. By framing independence as a rights struggle, Indian leaders made it clear that the goal was not only political power but also restoration of human dignity. The freedom struggle united diverse communities under the common demand for human rights, turning India's independence into both a national and universal cause. To fully understand the denial of human rights in India, it is useful to compare it with global developments. During the same period, Western nations were embarrassing the ideas of democracy and equality, while denying those very principles in their colonies. uh, One can see the contradictions. The 18th century saw the American Revolution and the French Revolution, both of which emphasized liberty, equality, and human rights. In the 19th century, Britain itself expanded voting rights to more of its citizens and celebrated democratic institutions, yet in India, none of these values were applied, or none of such concessions or rights were given to Indians. Indians were ruled by decree, not consent. While British citizens enjoyed rights such as freedom of speech, press, and assembly, Indians were censored, silenced, and punished for dissent. This double standard exposed the hypocrisy of colonialism. Britain claimed to stand for liberty at home but denied it abroad, and that is why it was called un-British rule in India. Even within the empire, racial discrimination was clear. A British official in India could insult or mistreat Indians without consequences, while Indians faced severe punishments for resisting authority. There was no equality before law and no justice for the colonized. This global comparison highlights the contradiction of imperialism. While human rights were being celebrated as universal ideals, they were being violated or they were being systematically denied to millions in colonies like India. This contradiction strengthened the moral case for independence everywhere, as Indian leaders pointed out the inconsistency of Britain's claims versus its colonial practices. The long period of British rule left behind a deep legacy of human rights violations. The economic exploitation drained India's wealth, leaving the country poor and underdeveloped, as was the case with most of the erstwhile colonies. Industries were destroyed, agriculture was weakened, and millions of people were left in chronic poverty. Socially, the denial of education and cultural rights created generations who were disconnected from their traditions and denied opportunities for growth. Women, in particular, suffered from illiteracy, unemployment, and extreme poverty. Famines scared the nation, killing millions and leaving families broken. Politically, the absence of democracy and justice delayed India's development of self governing institutions. Instead of learning from a gradual evolution of democracy, India had to start from scratch after independence. The repressive legal and administrative systems also left behind a culture of bureaucracy and authoritarianism, completely destroying a very efficient system of janpadas, grassroots democracy, and uh, efficient governance and administration in India, in ancient India. The psychological impact was also significant. The constant humiliation, racial discrimination, and denial of dignity created a colonial mindset that Indians had to struggle to overcome even after independence. However, this legacy also fueled resistance. The memory of oppression became a powerful source of unity for Indians. The demand for independence was framed as the demand for justice, equality, and human rights. In this way, the violations of the British period shaped the modern India nation's commitment to freedom and democracy. To conclude, the British period in India was marked by systematic and widespread violation of human rights. Politically, Indians were denied freedom of speech, press, and representation. Economically, they were burdened with heavy taxation, loss of land, and destruction of industries. Socially, their education and cultural rights were undermined, and women faced extreme hardships. Millions died in famines that could have been prevented, while soldiers were exploited for wars that were not their own. The British justified their rule as a civilizing mission, but as thinkers like Will Durant and Dadabhai Naoroji showed, it was nothing more than exploitation. The double standards of Britain, promoting democracy at home while denying it in colonies, revealed the hypocrisy of imperialism. Yet, out of this suffering grew resilience. Indians resisted, protested, and organized. The freedom struggle became the demand for human rights as much for political independence. It united people across regions, classes, and communities in the pursuit of dignity and justice. Legacy of colonialism remains a reminder that freedom is not only about sovereignty but also about ensuring rights for every individual. India's independence was therefore both a national victory and a human rights triumph. Thank you. We'll continue human rights in India in the next lecture.